Hello all, a big welcome to this Diversity and Inclusion webinar on women in the workplace. My name is Desiree and I'm a content strategy lead here at Headspring and I'm your host today. Even though we will talk specifically a bit about diversity and inclusion in financial services, this is highly applicable to all industries. Throughout the webinar, we would love for you to send in questions. You can do that by clicking on the question mark and we will try to address them towards the end of the Q&A. With me today is Sapna Welsh, who is an executive coach and consultant in diversity and inclusion, a facilitator and author, most recently of Women Leaders, The Power of Working Abroad. I'm also here with Kim Andrade, who is seasoned in leadership development, diversity, inclusion, and organizational consulting. It's really great to have you both here, and let's kick off. Over to you.
Thank you, Desiree. Welcome to all of you. Today we are going to share some very actionable ideas that you can take back to your organizations in order to attract, include, develop, and retain women in your workplace. And as Desiree shared, we will follow the session with time for Q&A. So the global pandemic has disproportionately impacted women. Some studies are saying that women have been set back more than 3 decades. So today we're going to spend our time in this session exploring behaviors that women professionals can practice, so that way women professionals can increase their resilience and confidence to increase their power to stay. We're going to talk about allyship and identify strategies for male allies to support female colleagues and for female colleagues to support female colleagues, and to really spend time understanding how we can redefine success through allyship. And then finally, we're going to learn 3 things that organizations can do to re-engage, retain, and support women in the workplace. I'd like to start out with a poll. I don't know when any of you are younger if you ever went to a slumber party or a get-together with friends where you played I think it was 2 truths and a lie, but today we're going to play 3 truths and a lie. There are 4 statements that are going to come up in a poll, and what we would like you to do is vote on the one that you believe is the lie. Which one is the lie? The 4 statements: number 1, women are 24% more likely to permanently lose their jobs compared to men. Number 2, in every year through 2019, the average overall attrition rate for companies, percentage of employees leaving, was slightly higher for men than women. Number 3, on average, across the globe, women during COVID are spending 4 hours more in unpaid labor each week than men. And number 4, women in emerging economies are struggling even more, reporting greater challenges and feeling them more acutely than workers in developed economies. Desiree, is the poll open?
Yes, the poll is open. Everyone is voting now.
Okay, what do the results show?
So we can see the results here. The first question had 8%, the second 58%, the third 33%, and no one voted for the fourth.
Okay, we got some smart folks on the line here. That's wonderful. Yes, the first one, 24% more likely to permanently lose their jobs compared to men. One study of employment and income trends that covered 6 countries resulted in this particular percentage, that women are 24% likely to permanently lose their jobs compared to men. So this is a truth. Number 2, sounds like a lot of you voted for this one to be the lie. it is actually the truth. Before COVID-19, women had slowly been making some progress in the workplace, and we're going to take a deeper dive into what that looks like or looked like in financial services in just a moment. Number 3, that was the lie. So globally, when you look at the number of hours more spent in unpaid labor, women spending more than men in unpaid labor, it's actually much higher, 15 hours more. And in fact, an interesting statistic, they say that men provide unpaid care on a full-time basis. That's about 1.5% of men compared to 21.7% of women. So generally speaking, before or pre-pandemic times, women were already spending a lot more time, as we're probably all familiar with. And during COVID, the gap has just furthered even deeper, with now women spending 15 hours more in unpaid labor each week than men. And number 4, a truth. Emerging economies are struggling even more. And in emerging economies, the challenges are even greater, and the women in these economies are feeling the pressures even more acutely. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening in financial services. I mentioned that we were going to take a deeper dive. Before COVID-19, women had slowly been making some progress. So if you look at this graph across the bottom, there's the years, and then up and down on the left-hand side, there's the percentages. And if you look at that gray box, projected growth 2020 to 2030, we were at about 22% as far as women in leadership roles in 2019. And the projection for women in leadership roles in financial services was to grow to about 31% by 2030, which still puts that number below overall parity. And another interesting reflection was that in financial services, for each additional woman that was added to the C-suite, the number of women in senior leadership roles rose by threefold, the multiplier effect. And unfortunately, when the pandemic hit, as mentioned, these same roles were found to be almost twice as vulnerable as men's roles. Therefore, the big story that this graph tells, the succession pipeline in financial services for women is at great risk. And strategies for improving leadership outcomes for women should now be more aggressive, multifaceted, more inclusive. And this graph really does tell a deep story. It's imperative that we take action now. One last graph to really drive the impact home. The impact of getting off track with succession and talking about taking action now. So if we take action now, we could actually improve gender equity and could add $13 trillion to the global GDP. That is what this McKinsey report is sharing. In a do-nothing scenario, which is that first column, gender parity regression due to COVID-19, that's assuming that the negative impact of COVID-19 on women remains unaddressed. In that case, the global GDP in 2030 would be $1 trillion below where it would have been if COVID-19 had affected men and women equally in their respective areas. Wow. But if action is taken now, if you look to the far right column, to achieve best in region gender parity improvements, $13 trillion could be added. And it would, quite frankly, raise the number of female to male participation in the workforce in the hundreds of millions across the globe. So now that we understand it's the time to take action, that there's real money behind this as far as opportunities when we take action, where do we begin? Well, today we're going to look at some actions that can start getting us back on track. We're going to start with, what can women do? So for any of the women on the call, to really think about, how's the pandemic affecting you or impacting you personally? As allies, what can allies do? And then we're going to wrap up with what can organizations do? So what can organizations do to reduce the overall impact? So with that, let's dive into what women can do. For women on the webinar today, we intentionally are starting with the what each of you can do for yourselves. I believe the quote is, be the change you want to see in the world. So if you notice on our slide, the only image we have here is Wonder Woman and the word resilience. Our advice, don't try to be Wonder Woman. You know, the woman that can do it all. I know I've been there. Kim and I were talking about being Wonder Woman ourselves and being guilty of it when we were preparing to present to all of you and share with you today. No one can manage to do everything they want to do, at least not all at the same time. One of the women that we had interviewed for the book that we researched and wrote all around women in the international workforce was a very senior leader for United Nations volunteers. And she shared a lovely quote that she said, look, I think I've really come to terms with the fact that I can't do it all, in the sense that I can't be perfect. None of us can be perfect. And there's always going to be some degree of imperfection, both professionally and personally. It sounds like such a simple statement, but it's hard, isn't it? Therefore, it's really important to ask for help. No one can do it all by themselves, nor should they be expected to do so. So how do we fight this Wonder Woman tendency? Common themes that came up among senior leaders that we interviewed across the globe. 3 things: forgiveness, ask for help, leverage your strengths. This isn't easy. If it was easy, we'd all be doing it, right? We would have that cape, we could pull it on, pull it off whenever we'd like to. But leaning into the discomfort of forgiving yourself, of asking for help, and honing in on strengths is how to build resilience. Now, if you have a sheet of paper, or if you have another tab open, or you can open another tab on your computer and your phone, I'd like you to jot something down. Think about what's one thing that you've been beating yourself up about. Take a second, write it down. Now, if it was a piece of paper, I ask that you crumple it up, throw it away. Forgive yourself. That's where it starts, grace towards oneself. Next, think about something that's really sucking your time, a challenging responsibility. Jot that down. Really, I mean it. Take a second, write it down. Now think about, who can I ask for help? Who can help me with this? I can't tell you the number of folks in my coaching practice, senior leaders across the globe that say, there's no one that can help me. And yet when we really spend time creatively thinking about the challenge, creatively considering where we might be able to look for help, there are folks to help. And don't just think about your work network. Think about different categories of support networks you have. Who is your tribe? The pandemic, and obviously the isolation that the pandemic has contributed to, has really separated many of us from our tribes, but it's more important than ever that we really think about who that tribe is and reach out to them, even if it's not in a traditional sense. Ask for help. A third theme that I mentioned that came out on how to battle the Wonder Woman tendency is leveraging your strengths. When you identify your strengths, you're in greater control. The greater our sense of control, the greater our resilience, right? That locus of control, when it sits here, we fundamentally become more resilient because we are in a better position to say, how can I cope with this? We might not be able to change the overall event, but we definitely can change how we respond to it and thus the outcome. It also positions you to be in a better position to set boundaries and figure out what to say yes to, what to say no to, what to say yes and to. A favorite anecdote that some of you may have heard around the power of strengths is years ago, they did a study. I don't know if any of you went through one of those speed reading courses or you know someone that went through a speed reading course. Guilty, I put my daughter through one. It was really beneficial if any of you are thinking about it. But they took two groups of readers. The gifted group was reading about 350 words per minute, already pretty fast. The normal group was reading about 90 words per minute. Put both groups through a 3-week speed reading course, only 3 weeks. The gifted group increased, the normal group increased. So the normal group, again, they were reading at 90 words per minute. They improved to about 150 words. Wow, 66% increase. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is I'm going to invite you to put this into the chat. Desiree, unfortunately, for whatever reason, I can't seem to see the chat, so if you can weigh in on some of the responses. My question for you is, the gifted group, these kids were reading at 350 words per minute. This was already their strength. They went way up. That's the hint. What is the percentage increase you believe that the gifted group was able to accomplish? Again, normal group went up by 66%. How much did the gifted group increase? Go ahead, put it in chat.
Just click on the question mark and send in your guesses.
Any responses, Desiree?
So we have one of 120%.
Okay, higher.
Another one higher. Okay. One at 160. Here's a 75, but that was just before you said higher. 130.
Higher.
Oh, much higher? Okay, much higher.
Okay.
150.
828%.
Oh, wow.
They went up to 2,900 words per minute. Why do I love this story? Because of the moral of the story. Any of us can improve through hard work, but when we can hone in on what our strengths are, we can really get to where we want to go easier, faster, have more energy in the process. That's what happens when we can build on our strengths and our talents. So again, time to take off that Wonder Woman cape, and hopefully there were some takeaways that you as an individual woman, and for that matter, for those of you that might be men on the call, absolutely, same things apply. Now I'd like to talk about allyship. For both men and women on the webinar, I want to talk about how to increase staying power of women through allyship. How can you jumpstart engaging allies now? So let's talk about definition of an ally. An ally is someone from a non-marginalized group who uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalized group. Being an ally is a good thing. I'll tell you what allyship is not. It is not passive. It is not neutral. It's not, hey, I really believe in you. Good luck. There's a second category I'd like to talk about as well, performative allies. There are some other terms out there that might be commonly used, but performative allyship is when an individual from a majority group professes their support or solidarity with a marginalized group, but is not always helpful to that group. So for example, maybe it's a male leader in your organization who's constantly posting all these amazing posts on Pay Equity Day across Instagram or across intranet channels, and yet doesn't ever really do anything to diversify his own team at work. Typically comes back with, gosh, there just aren't any really good women candidates out there in our field. I can't really find anyone. So take out that same sheet of paper if you have it. List people that you know very quickly in category 1 and 2. Category 1, allies. Category 2, performative allies. And this exercise of figuring out who you have in each of these categories is important, because now what I'd like to share with you is 5 actions you can take immediately to engage allies and see if you can enlist performative allies. So if you didn't have a chance to really fill out that list fully, now I ask that you take it away and really think about it so you can figure out who to engage and who you might be able to start enlisting. So here are the 5 actions. 1, listen and educate yourself to be an ally. Ask questions. You might want to hit up Google first because you don't want to make it anybody else's responsibility to become your personal tutor. There's a lot of great resources out there. And then when you come to the point of asking questions or engaging your allies or enlisting performative allies, here are a few good questions that you can bring forward. 1, perhaps you ask, what is the data telling us about the impact of the pandemic on women in our organization? 2, what specific actions or policies have you seen that address the potential risk of women leaving? Perhaps you ask yourself that question as an ally. 3, what communication or messages have I heard from the organization that reinforce that the organization really understands the risk and how it's being managed? And these are just, quick and dirty, a few first questions you can really start asking to engage allies, to become an ally. 2, lift up marginalized voices, consult with them, bring diverse people into the conversation. Men tend to actually gravitate towards mentoring other men because they have shared interests, like attracts like. Completely understandable. But an opportunity here is for men to really think about how they might be able to actively mentor women. This is from a Lean In report, and I believe McKinsey also reported on this, but there's a real opportunity here. And women are less likely to have mentors who advocate for and promote them. Yet another opportunity. 3, call out bias. Take the burden off of someone else that might already be feeling marginalized. 4, respect safe places. This is important. Everyone wants to take time off. So think about when you're going to become that ally, show up as an ally, engage others, bring other voices into the room. And lastly, don't take issues with people coming together around any particular shared identity. So for example, if there's a women in leadership group in your organization, one thing that they have found is when women come together with other women, there's just different topics and a different sense of safety that's created in these groups that can allow different conversations and different opportunities to take risks, and that's okay. And appreciate the fact that that can sit in conjunction with other opportunities to be an active ally among women leaders in the organization. So with all those thoughts around allies, women for women, men for women, now I'm going to hand it over to Kim to walk us through what organizations can do. Okay, Kim, it's all yours.
Thank you. Just get into presentation mode. There we go. So as Sapna said, turning to what organizations can do. So first, when you are mapping out ideas for actions that your organization can take to increase gender equity, gender representation for women, first you want to think about organizational culture, so the context of what you're operating under, and from a high level think about your organizational culture in terms of the simplest definition that how I define culture is how we do things around here. So how do you do things around your organization? Think about that culture, that organizational culture, as two main categories of actions. So you have form and substance, or what can be described as structural and behavioral actions. So what we're going to focus on is the structural, things like your charters and your documents, your handbook, your policies and initiatives and programs. And when you're thinking about enhancing your culture of including women and promoting women and giving them a place where they feel like they can succeed and belong, you want to be thinking about the culture in which they operate. And one thing to keep in mind, although you can't tackle it all at once, is that the actions on the left should mirror the actions on the right. So what you say you do and the policies and the programs that exist, that in actual real life, how people feel, how people interact with each other, and their behaviors, that those things mirror one another. So it's important to take a hard look at your organization as you are going about the actions that we're going to talk about today. If you have engagement survey data already, that's great. If you're thinking about going out and doing an engagement survey, just be very careful. You have to be prepared to respond and share the results, and that takes some preparation and anticipation. So what I want to share with you today is 3 specific actions that you can take immediately, as I said, that fall under the structural category. So with recruiting and interviewing, one story that really changed the way that I approached the interviewing process and how we recruit at a large organization I worked in the past, it was a specific recruitment at a senior level of the organization. And that's always challenging because there's a lot at stake when you're recruiting at the higher levels of the organization. So we were recruiting for a division controller position. So think of it as like a CFO, a mini CFO for about a $75 million business. And we were very excited about this recruitment. Our top candidate was basically what I say, a rock star. So she was a fierce, smart, accomplished woman, and we knew she could be successful. She would prove herself. There was no doubt. But we also knew that she could be a role model and a mentor for our younger female professionals who were in the financial, accounting space, and are really looking to those senior role models, at this level of the organization. And we were heartbroken. She turned down our offer. When we went back to her and said, why? Is it the packages? Is it the benefits? What could we do? We can work with it. And she said, in your interview process, I did not interview with one single woman aside from HR. That was our call to action. We lost out on our number 1 candidate that we knew could help move the needle with gender equity, because we were putting out a face of the organization that was, frankly, European white male dominant. So to fix that, what we did was we identified individuals in the organization who were diverse. So we needed, nationality, ethnicity, diversity, and of course we wanted female diversity. So we asked people if they would be interested in participating in interview panels, and so that as we interview for different positions throughout the year, we have people who are interested, who are invested, and then we offered training. So we created interviewing training that focused on not just hiring for the qualities and the characteristics for the job that we knew were important, but that we could also prepare them to mitigate gender bias. And so this was a training that we required all hiring managers, all HR, and then these additional interview panelists that we could then call on and better represent a more diverse organization. And this was not just good in terms of representing to the candidates, but it involved more people in the interview process. So we engaged more people, a more diverse group of employees in the interview process. But lastly, more diverse people in your interview process are going to offer diverse perspectives. So in an interview with a woman, I might pick up something different than if my male counterpart were interviewing a woman. So I can come back and say, well, I don't think that's what she meant at all, or here's how I perceived it. You know, here's what I thought of this particular behavior. So contributing those different perspectives in the interview process has multiple benefits. The second actions you can take fall under promotions and succession planning. So when you look at how decisions are made with regards to who gets promoted, who gets assigned those special projects, those high profile assignments, and who's being groomed for the next role, biases are very prevalent. As Sapna mentioned, like attracts like, so the affinity bias. Leaders will identify, mentor, recognize those who remind them of themselves, those who feel like they're part of some group, whether they went to the same university or they grew up in the same city or the same region, etc. It feels good to help other people that we believe are part of our tribe. So those things, those biases, make us force us to make assumptions. And it was during a lot of conversations that I experienced in my talent development and learning and development role, where I heard a lot of conversations. And this is where I came up with this concept of, specifically for women, the career highway and on-ramps and off-ramps. So if you think about a highway and you're maybe traveling in the fast lane, your career is going really fast and you're progressing fast, or maybe you're in the slower lane. And for a lot of women, when you decide to have children, start a family, many times women get off the highway. So they're on the off-ramp or the overpass, as we call it in the US. And we need to make sure that we're creating opportunities for them to get back on the highway at whatever speed they want. And leaders should not make assumptions about how fast they want to get back on the highway. If they want to get back on the highway and move all the way over to the passing lane, the fastest lane on the highway, that's not for us to decide. And so making assumptions just because a woman has just had a baby, for example, it does not mean that she wouldn't be interested in a really important, really intense, critical project for the organization. Could the project wait 2 months? Possibly. Maybe she's ready to jump back in, and her personal situation with her family and her children, it's all taken care of. So getting into the room, whomever can get into the room when these conversations are happening, need to challenge those assumptions, actively engage and manage the conversations in the room where those decisions are made. And it's also important that you're advocating for the people that are maybe up and coming but not yet recognized, right? If my tendency is to help people who look like me, act like me, feel like me, then all the men in the room who tend to be making the decisions, right? Most leadership teams are made up of men. they're not going to be openly identifying the women in the organization who could be potential candidates for these promotions and groomed for the next position. So whomever can get in those conversations and be advocating and pushing for our female colleagues. The other thing about this particular actions on promotions and succession planning is that if you have a senior leader in your organization who is an ally, perhaps an executive VP, a VP, a general manager, managing partner, any of these type of senior roles, more and more men are willing to be vocal allies. And so if you can get them involved and they can help start really advocating for the women in the organization who need to be put in that succession planning box, who could do this role next? Well, there is someone, and you might not know her yet. So engage those senior leaders who have already sort of put themselves out there as female allies. The third call to action is around exposure and development. So sort of very specifically under the talent development umbrella. As we all know, exposure is very important in building your career and growing within your organization or your profession. In most companies, opportunities to network and get exposure to senior leaders, again, it's quite closed because of our affinity bias and many other things. So as things open up, and wherever you are in the world, hopefully there is some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the COVID pandemic, and your organizations are going to be able to start having company events again in the near future. Whether it's the business meetings, quarterly meetings, annual meetings, whatever those events are that your company usually does, whether they're virtual or hopefully in person, it's really important that we get to the person who makes the invitation list, right? Who decides who goes to these meetings? Because let me tell you, I was in a role where I was in a brand new role that was a global talent position. And I had an advocate, an executive gentleman who was an advocate for me. And he was in charge of the guest list of his business meetings. And he told all of the GMs around the world, he said, she will be invited to every single meeting. She's part of the talent team and she needs to be there to get to know your talent. And it's her role and she has to be there. And the power of being in those meetings and getting to, as they say in the US, rub elbows with all of these senior leaders and leave an impression with them and make those connections, people I could then email later, even if they were halfway around the world and I only met once. We've met, I've been introduced, they know who I am. They're much more willing to work with me, to help me if I need a favor. And then they can go on to their organizations and say, oh yes, there's this person and here's what she does and you need to help her. Or so these opportunities to network and build relationships are incredibly important. So whomever in your organization is in charge of putting these events together, putting together the invitation list, getting more women in the room is quite important. And let me tell you, if you're the only one, if any of you have ever been the only one in one of these, big business meetings, and you look around and the men notice it too. So, more and more organizations are starting to notice, the optics of this are not good. We need to invite more women to these events so it's more representative of the outside world. So do what you can to insert yourself in the process of getting more women represented in these company events and networking events. And the second piece of exposure and development is in your early career pipeline programs and leadership development programs. So if you have a program I call career acceleration or early career pipeline, where you're recruiting university students, recent graduates, and then the management development or leadership development programs, one thing that you can do right away is start to, if you're not already, measuring gender metrics. So in these programs, what percentage of women, what percentage of men? What we're finding is that more and more women are graduating from the traditionally male-dominant fields, that those numbers are equaling out more and more. So it used to be, well, there are no women graduating in chemical engineering. There are no women, graduating with their MBAs or, whatever you're looking for. Well, that's not the case anymore. So you target universities that have gender, some gender equity. And then in your recruiting for that talent pipeline program, you make sure that your numbers match the universities that you're recruiting from. And in your leadership, your management development programs, start tracking, if you haven't already, the gender numbers, because once you start tracking it, once you start measuring it, it will call attention to it. And calling attention to it, getting those numbers in front of the right people and talking to them about, this is our pipeline for the future. You all saw Sapna's slides at the beginning talking about the call to action of the need of more women in leadership, specifically in financial services. Where are these women going to come from? They come from your early career pipeline programs and your training and development programs. So tracking that and creating that direct line of sight from those programs all the way through the need for leaders in the future is a really great way to get traction. When you're starting to report it to senior leadership, whether they ask for it or not, just start including it in your metrics and your data. When I created created and managed these programs in my prior life, we emphasized diversity in general, not just gender, but we emphasized diversity from the very beginning. So that was part of the program as we designed the programs, was that we wanted the programs to be designed for all types of people, all countries. I was working with 50 different countries around the world. And so it was very important that these programs were inclusive and that they represented well our organization's makeup, but also the external world's makeup. And so if you're calling attention to that diversity, the gender and other diversity metrics, it will force the attention and effort towards progress. So those are the 3 actions that you can take on behalf of the organization. Hopefully you took away some tidbits there. So in summary, before we turn it over to the Q&A, hopefully you have some questions. We're open to very specific questions you may have. We started with behaviors that women can practice to build confidence and resilience. Next, we covered how women and men can practice allyship to advance women. And Sapna gave you, 5 ways to be an ally and what that means. And we went through 3 actions or areas of action that organizations can take to support and develop women in the workplace. We would like to turn it over to any questions that you have at this point, as we know that there's so many options, and so would like to get any specific needs that the audience has for us.
Yeah, so I mean, we actually got a lot of questions in. So let's kick off. I think the first one was, someone was wondering if they heard correctly that for every female senior leader, there are 3 male leaders. Is that something that was said in the beginning? Yeah, so that's okay.
That's from a Deloitte study that was recently released. Well, recently meaning about 2019.
Mhm.
And that was reflective of the multiplier effect in financial services, that for every C-suite female leader that was brought in, there was 3 senior leaders that were one level below, if you will, in the succession.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Mhm.
So what's if you would compare kind of, I guess, the issues in the financial services sectors versus other sectors, any comments around that?
In terms of anything specific?
Oh, I guess just the kind of the issues that women are facing. If you've seen any, if there are any particular issues that financial services has specifically comparing to other sectors.
I would say at a very broad level, every sector has its unique characteristics. And
Mhm.
even within the financial services sector, different financial services firms are starting at different points when it comes to diversity and inclusion and female equity. So the real key is, regardless of whether it's financial services or which financial services firm, it is imperative to always approach diversity and inclusion from a very custom lens. Kim, anything you'd like to add to that? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, like other male-dominated industries, when you're comparing financial services to other industries, I would look at what are the skills, behaviors that have made men in the past successful in the financial services industry. And you look at those behaviors, and traditionally are those behaviors and competencies that women are taught? Are they brought up, in society, right? When I think of financial services, I think of the selling aspect. My good friend was a financial services rep for years, and she was very successful at it, but she was also not very feminine. She was assertive, she was pushy, she was really good at asking for what she wanted. She just called people up and said, we need to meet. And so there are behaviors that in the past society has told us are more masculine traits.
Mhm.
And women tend to not be taught these things. And so what behaviors has your organization defined as, here's what it takes to be X, or depending on the role? And then looking to see, how do we bring women into that fold? And if we're finding that women traditionally, our female applicants, are not exhibiting those things, well, how do we redefine success? Going back to one of Sapna's points earlier, how do we adapt so that women can be perfectly successful in these roles? So that's the first thing I think of when you asked that question about the difference between financial services and other industries. It's really, what are the competencies and behaviors we're expecting of our people to be successful, and how are we upskilling or including women in those competencies?
Okay, that's a really interesting answer. So I guess which organizations are doing a good job at retaining women? And I guess a follow-up question to that as well is, you mentioned that organizations, what they can do to help with recruiting and interviewing, but what can you do as an applicant? Because I know, many people have unfortunately been made redundant in the last year and are probably still interviewing. And what can you do anything as an applicant?
I'd be happy to cover that. So I know the first question, I know personally because I'm attached to it, Northwestern Mutual Financial Group in the US. They do a good job in terms of promoting gender equity. They do a lot of external communication around it. There's a lot on LinkedIn, there's a lot on Facebook and Instagram, and programs to amplify and elevate women. So they have women's coaching, they have women's mentoring, they have, you know, women's network. So there's a lot of support and attention given to women to grow within the organization. So that happens to be one that I'm just personally connected with, and I know an executive coach in that space. But in terms of applicants, you know, it's really hard right now because a lot of people are, I know there, for every position, there's possibly hundreds of candidates. And so I would say the two biggest things I would say, first, LinkedIn profile. You know, there's lots of tools online. If you say, you know, how to improve my LinkedIn profile, and it goes through like 10 steps. So get your LinkedIn profile really enhanced, ask people to write reviews for you. Of course, offer to write one for them. That's a great, you know, reciprocity. So your LinkedIn profile is a really great way to, you know, get some attention around your candidacy, because we are, as HR professionals, we are getting a lot of candidates. It's hard to sort them out. And then your resume, make sure for each job that you are applying, you tailor your resume to that job. So you might reorder what you know, you reorder the tasks, or you emphasize different things. And your cover letter. Your cover letter is, you know, really your introduction. That's your first impression. So in your cover letter, call out the things that are most important in that job that they're advertising for. So you just make it so easy for the recruiter to look through and say, oh, yep, this person's perfect. We want to talk to them. And last thing, sorry, I just thought of another one. Show progression. If you can show, obviously, progression in your resume, HR recruiters, they're looking for people who've shown, you know, progression or have that potential to progress. So if you kind of want to showcase, you know, that you've progressed in your career, or you have that ability to progress.
So it sounds like it's about making the recruiter's job much easier.
Yeah.
Right.
It is. Yes, we appreciate that. And selling yourself, you know, it's important. It's sometimes awkward for especially women. We're not good at, you know, being the peacock, as they say, but it's important.
And to build on what Kim said, Kim, thank you. Those were wonderful, very pragmatic approaches and tactics to position oneself as a very solid candidate. And I'd like to revisit what we spent some time on, which is truly identifying your strengths. Where do your strengths lie? How do they give you energy? Where do they give you energy? What are your passions? In other words, really being very specific and intentional in the types of roles you're applying for, creating a pseudo rubric prior to even sending your resume out there. So serving yourself, saying, I don't want to just take the first thing that comes my way, but what are some of the most important criteria for me to assess any potential offer on, to ensure that this is truly a fit for me? Having said that, also to be a bit flexible. Kim was talking about career progression from a personal standpoint. That progression might look like a lateral move, might look like an upward move, might look like a diagonal move. So to be open-minded, assuming that the opportunity does indeed leverage strengths and meet some personal imperatives and goals. So serve yourself as well in the whole process. And then, excuse me, still getting over a bit of a cold. And I believe the other thing you had started with, Desiree, is what organizations are doing a good job with retaining women. And the only other thought I wanted to add here is, I believe any organization that's willing to take a good hard look at themselves and say, honestly, what are we doing? What are we doing well? Where do we want to be? And what can we do better to get there? So this is a journey. And so often, organizations, just as we as individuals, we're culprit. We can fall prey to the idea of saying, nope, already checked the box. We're doing all this good stuff. But what's our end goal? And what do we need to do to get there? What can we do more of? What can we do better? We have one client that we're working with right now. who is really looking, they're a global cloud computing company, and they're really looking at overall soup to nuts. What is it that we're doing? Where do we want to go? And how can we get there? And so that offers them a lot of different levers that they can pull. I, a couple of years ago, worked with a financial services company. It was a regional bank, and they really wanted to go into, they facilitated the GPS, Gender Parity Spotlight Survey, to identify what barriers women in their organization were facing. And those barriers were actually identified by the women. So the women in the organization from certain levels, certain groups were surveyed, and they used that as their traffic light report to identify again where they are and where they wanted to go and what they needed to do to get there. So the big message there, to really take that long, hard look. Where am I today? What am I doing well, and what can I do better?
Okay, so I also had a question. Let's see where it is. Oh yeah, here. You mentioned that men also noticed the lack of women at meetings and events, and someone wondered if there's any research or case studies around this, because I guess that just they don't really believe it.
That's a good question. No, this is anecdotal for me in my 20 years of being at these events. Is that the men in the room who are male allies, let's be clear, they're paying attention, right? They know that diversity and inclusion and gender equity is important. It's becoming more important to just the general population. Also, a lot of these male leaders, they have wives who have careers, they have daughters, and especially the ones with daughters, and then the daughters are going to university and starting to look for internships. So those male allies, they do pay attention. They do come up to me and say, I just noticed there's no diversity in this room. Yeah. So it does happen, but it does take a male ally who's a bit clued in to the overall, the overall issue. But no, I haven't done any research on it. It'd be good. It'd be interesting. What percentage of men actually notice?
And there actually
my next project.
There's some HBR articles around the power of women showing up in meetings. In other words, how that can position women in a greater position of power. So there's some articles relative to that. As far as men noticing the presence of or the lack of women in the room, there's topics around it, articles around it. As Kim mentioned, I believe there's an article called Through the Eyes of My Daughter. And it's more of an editorial type of article. I can't recall where it was published. It's probably a decade old, but it's very much building on what Kim mentioned, which was Through the Eyes of My Daughter. It was a male leader realizing that women were not in a lot of these senior level meetings, at least not in the magnitude they should be, in order to bring diverse voices to the table.
Okay. So we also have another question, or rather, I guess a bit of a statement from one of our listeners. And I know this listener also wondered whether we can unmute them so they can ask a question. And unfortunately, that's not possible in this webinar. But this person said that should we not stop talking about speaking up, but about listening instead? And she said that she did take, I guess, a bit of an offense with the idea that we should, or that the assumption that she's speeding up herself, and the kind of reminder that she shouldn't. So I just want to see if you have any comments around that.
Yeah, I believe that both have a place. So I do quite a bit of work with women leaders and women leaders in large organizations. And this does continue to be a trend that comes forward around the idea of understanding what it is that what our strengths are, what we want, what we don't want, advocating for ourselves. And I hope that what came forward when we were talking about allyship women for women, men for women, either. It's that idea of asking questions and listening. Listening is so key. So yes, I absolutely agree. It is the foundation of leader as coach, to ask those powerful questions and to listen. Kim?
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes or concepts is that you can't challenge, you can't change what you don't understand. And in order to understand something, you have to first listen. So, if there's something you're wanting to change or you're wanting to challenge, and in this case, it's, advocating for gender equity, for women in the workplace, and how do we move the needle and make up for the progress we've lost over the last year. There is an aspect to that is, listening, paying attention to the context that you're working within. As I said, kind of taking that big picture approach. You don't just dive in and say, I'm going to do this, this, this. You first look at the organization you're working within, the group that you're working within, the opinions and the thoughts of the leader, who really has a big impact on the culture of the organization. So there's a lot of listening. There's a lot of being perceptive, what people say, but then what their body language, and, I say this and I do that. So yes, absolutely. Listening is a big part of it, but not just listening.
Yeah.
Taking action.
Okay, well, I believe that we're actually out of time. It went really quickly. A big thank you to you, Sapna and Kim, for joining. It's been amazing. That was very, very insightful. If you want to rewatch this webinar or send it to a friend or colleague, you will receive a link in an email in a few days. Do also keep an eye out for other interesting webinars that will come up, as we run them quite frequently. And if you haven't already, do follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter, where we also keep you in the loop with really interesting content. So yeah, thank you again for joining. It was a real pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And enjoy the rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.